Good morning, gasaholics. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you've got gas, the morning edition. Thanks for tuning in this Tuesday morning. It's an interesting Tuesday because it comes after Monday and before Wednesday, right? Yeah. Well, we talk about cars from the Tri-5 era. And when we say Tri-5s, normally people refer to the 55, 6, and 7 Chevrolets. Now, Ford was there too, and so was Plymouth. Those were the three leading car brands in 1955 through 57. Now, Chevrolet and Ford swapped positions in 1957, and Plymouth held its own in third place all 3 years. But the more interesting cars are said to be the Chevrolets. Why? Well, the introduction of the 265 V8 wedge head engine. Now, that was revolutionary for the time for Chevrolet and for low-priced cars because traditionally V8 engines were luxury items or on the higher-priced cars. Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Chryslers, DeSotos, big Dodges, they had V8 engines beginning early on. Now, Ford had the flathead V8, and they were the first low-dollar or entry-level type car that got a V8 engine. And they persevered with that flathead engine from 1932 through 1953. Good morning, Richard. How are you doing? And Bobby Dye. Cassie Nunez, how are you doing? All right, so the V8 engine for the Ford, been around since the 30s. Everyone was playing catch-up after that, but in the low-price field, no one had a V8. Chevrolet initially tried a V8 in 1917, but Willie Durant decided, nah, low-price cars don't get V8s. So he stuck a four-cylinder in the Chevrolets. Excuse me. The six-cylinder came about later on, and six-cylinder was the mainstay for Chevrolet through 1954. Plymouth wasn't far behind with that, but they used the flathead six-cylinder. Ford finally came out with a flathead six-cylinder in the 40s, but it didn't stick around that much longer. Actually, it went away in 1954 when the overhead valve six-cylinder came in, along with the overhead valve V8. Although the Ford V8 was a V8, it wasn't really all that successful when it came to performance. It was heavy. It was difficult. It did not have the reliability that Ford wanted. So the first overhead valve V8 in 1954, it was a V8, and they beat Chevrolet to the punch with an overhead valve V8 engine. But it wasn't really a performance engine, kind of like the Chevrolet was. The Chevrolet was a much lighter, simplistic engine. It worked better. Plymouth still did not have a V8 in 1954, but they did get one in 1955. And it was a variant of a Dodge engine and what they called part of the polysphere motors, which were, well, kind of like a Hemi without the Hemi head. It was a low-cost V8 engine by Chrysler standards. It was okay, and it was a shared engine. In other words, Plymouth didn't have their own engine. But in 1956, that all changed. Now, Ford bumped the cubic inches of their cars, V8 engines, starting in 1955 to 272 cubic inches, and later 292 and 57. Chevrolet, 265 and 55 and 56, going to 283 cubic inches in 1957. Plymouth, well, it was 241 cubic inches in 1955, and it was basically a Hemi without the Hemi heads. Now, the poly engines were pretty darn good, though. They weren't a bad engine. They were less expensive than the Hemi. The head from the polysphere would bolt on to an equivalent Hemi. So if you had a 241 cubic inch Dodge Hemi, the polysphere head from the Plymouth, I'm told, would bolt on. And likewise, the Hemi head would go on to the Plymouth engine. But that's because the Plymouth engine was not a true Plymouth engine. That changed in 1956. 270, 277 cubic inches, and a rare 303 cubic inch V8 was entered into the Plymouth lineup in 1956. Now, 1955, 6, and 7, Chevrolets had body changes. Basically the same car, but they put fins on them, bigger fins, and changed the grills and the bumpers, and the roofs, the doors, and trunks stayed the same. Ford 55 and 56 are pretty much the same way. Trim changes. Dashboard changed a little bit. You no longer had the see-through speedometer that the 55 and 54 Fords had. And 56 got a more lavish dashboard with a hooded speedometer. Kind of cool. I liked it. It kind of set the stage for 57 when Ford totally redesigned their Tri-5 car. The 57 Ford was a sales success. Lower, longer, leaner, and up to 312 cubic inches and supercharged available. Dual quads as well. Ford led the sales race in 1957. Now, my interest, though, is on the Plymouth side. And Richard, I know you're going to like this, Richard Candyhead, but my family was kind of a Mopar family. My father's first car that I remember was a Nash sedan. Kind of neat when we went to drive-ins. Seats all folded down. The whole inside of the car became a bed. His next car was a Studebaker. Kind of neat. Suicide rear doors, bullet nose, kind of Tuckerish. Kind of liked it, but it didn't last too long, and I'm not sure why. I was too young to really pay that much attention to it. He then bought a Dodge. Excuse me. He bought a Dodge, 1953 or 4 Dodge, little coupe, and he liked that car, but it didn't stay around very long either. And I'm not sure why he changed cars that often. It wasn't like we had money to buy new cars all the time, but these were used cars. He didn't have a new car, but his first new car was a 1956 Plymouth Belvedere 4-door hardtop model, but they didn't call it a hardtop. Let me take a look. They called it a club sedan, although it was a pillarless 4-door hardtop by today's standards, and it was cool. My dad's car, black and white. They called it a sport sedan, not a club sedan, excuse me, sport sedan. It had the Belvedere trim on the side, which was unique in comparison to the Savoys and the other model Plymouths. The chassis, well, that was continued a carryover. Same basic chassis from 1955. And you know what? The suspension was the same as in my 1948 Plymouth. Very limited changes there. But what they did well. The 56 Plymouth echoed the styling that Chevrolet finally came out with in 57. Exner was a stylist at Chrysler Corporation, and he put the nice sharp fins on the back of the Plymouth and canted the front in the opposite direction, making the car look like it was moving strong. Also in 1956, it was the first year the Plymouth Mayflower, or the boat, did not appear on the car. Nowhere. They took it off, and the hood ornament was kind of reminiscent of a jet plane, similar to the 55 and 56 Plymouths, or Chevrolets. The Plymouth was an interesting car, though. It was good looking, it was longer, and if you got the Fury version, it was even lower. Now, Plymouth was also in the horsepower races along with Ford and Chevrolet in that time. And later on in 1956, they came out with a Power Pack version. Prior to that, the cars were equipped with 2-barrel carburetors. The Power Pack added a 4-barrel carburetor and dual exhaust. It created a little bit more horsepower for that car. But when you got the Fury, now you jump from the 277 cubic inch V8 to a 303 V8, Canadian design. Now, those engines, the 303, the 271, and the 277, and the 270, were strictly in Plymouths. They had no interchangeability with Dodge, Chrysler, or DeSoto. These were unique engines to the Plymouth line, and that gave Plymouth a little bit of an edge. Now, in 1955, Plymouth put the shifter on the dashboard. It was a stalk that came out on the right side of the driver, and they could shift into low, drive, neutral, no park. Had reverse, neutral, drive, and low. Park was a separate lever. In 1956, at the complaints of the people with the stock in 55, still not following the normal trends, they came out with push-button drive. All Chrysler products in 1956 were push-button. The push-button console was on the left side of the driver, which made everything move over, which became the tradition. It was inconvenient at that time because they wanted the driver to have control of everything, and the left side was a good place for it, but now that's where the push buttons were. Now, was that unique to the Chrysler Corporation? No. Now, a lot of other companies had push buttons. They all ran to the push button design in 1956. That was including Mercury, Packard, and a host of others, all using push-button drive. Now, that stayed in fashion through 1965 for Chrysler. But at government insistence, which seems to have disappeared, push-button drive went away in 1965, and everyone had to have a standardized shifter. Whether it was on the column or on the floor, those were your two choices. So push-buttons went away. They have come back. Strangely enough, there is no regulation against it any longer. So someone saw the error of the stalk or the shifter, which could impale you in an accident, and decided to allow push buttons to come back. My wife's Ford product has push button drive, and it's a 2015. No. Yeah. No. Well, it's new. 17 maybe? Yeah, something like that. So it's got push button drive. Now, Chrysler kept the same suspension, as I said, that is in my 1948 Plymouth, which came about in the early 1940s, late 1930s. So not much of a change there. Now, on the Fury model, which got the dual quads, 277 cubic inches, gold side trim, sat an inch lower, and they made it a performance car for the time because it had 11-inch drum brakes. That's right, 11-inch. The standard Plymouth had 10-inch drum brakes front and rear. The upgraded Plymouth, the Belvedere's, got 11-inch in the front, kept the 10-inch in the back. The station wagon and the Fury got 11-inch drums front and rear. And the Fury got heavier springs, sat an inch lower to make it look longer. And it did. And the Fury had the gold anodized side trim. It was a performance car. And it started the performance movement for Chrysler, or Plymouth. Now, 57, that was a whole different year for Plymouth. As we saw the Ford enlarge its line, so did the fins and the size of the 57 Plymouths. And they got huge. It was also the end of a separate chassis. Plymouth became unibody. They became big. They became huge, finned cars in 1957. They had some issues with quality on their engines. The Plymouth engine went up to 350 cubic inches as an option. Dual quads on the Fury version, but they had rust issues. And they also had an issue with the ring seating. And Plymouths were noted for burning oil quite a bit. Hi, Bob Moravis. How are you doing? Floyd Lippincott Jr. sitting there with you watching? Okay. But I've got a soft spot in my head for the Plymouths. I love Plymouths. I love the Chrysler products. I've had a number of them. My mother did as well. My father's new car was the 56. My mother's next car was a 1953 Plymouth Belvedere. Well, let's see what Bob Alfred has to say. Now, Bob's saying his grandmother used to rev up his grandmother's 59 Plymouth and push the D button. Almost made a mistake of pushing the R button for race one time. Yeah. Ron Safran is out there. Good morning to you. You making coffee? I could use a cup of that right now. I just had some tea this morning. But the Plymouths have always been part of my family. Like I said, my dad had Chrysler products. He had the 53 Dodge, then the 56 Plymouth. My mother sold that when we moved out to California, and she bought a 53 Plymouth Belvedere. Now, that was a step up from the Dodge of the time. It was a hardtop. It was nicely outfitted. It had high drive, which was Chrysler's fluid drive, basically a 3-speed transmission with a torque converter. My mother couldn't drive a stick, or at least she didn't remember how to drive a stick. So this was the way for her to do it. You use the clutch only to put it in gear. You release the clutch, and the torque converter took over. You could stay in second gear around town and drive all the time. Excuse me. If you got up on the freeway, you pushed the clutch and then brought it back into third gear, and you cruised down the highway. That was easy for my mom. She liked that. Her next car, a 57 Plymouth Suburban wagon. Now, a lot of you may think that the Suburban was the name of General Motors or Chevrolet's truck type wagons. It may have been. They didn't register it. Plymouth grabbed it as well. So Plymouth labeled their station wagons since the early 1950s Suburbans. And the Suburban wagon for the Plymouth was a two-door to start with. Later on, the Plymouth line expanded, and you had Plymouth wagons, all called Suburbans. There were two-door, there were four-door, there were 9-passenger, there were 6-passenger. But they were all called Suburban wagons as well. Plymouth's V8, as I said, the high-fire V8, 277 cubic inches, 187 horsepower. Not too bad, considering the 265 was, well, 185 horsepower. So they're right in there. The Polysphere motor, kind of a semi-Hemi. And that's something that Chrysler came up with. It was basically a lower cost head on a Hemi block, and it still used a single rocker shaft, whereas the Hemi used dual rocker shafts, but had the valves in line like the Hemi with a kind of a hemispherical head, but not quite, giving it a cross-flow design. That technically gave it a little bit of an advantage horsepower-wise, but not really all that much. The 277 with the power pack option, which was the 4-barrel and dual exhaust, was rated at 200 horsepower. Now remember, in those days, the horsepower ratings were not the net horsepower that we see today. Starting in the early 1970s, we went away from the brake horsepower rating to a net. There's a difference of 20, 30 horsepower difference, the net horsepower being lower. So when someone talks to you about the smug devices killing horsepower, part of that dead horsepower was the difference in rating, not necessarily the difference in power. Power was still there. It was just rated at a lower horsepower because of the SAE net power ratings. So brake horsepower, 1956, 200 on the 277 with a single 4-barrel. Now, later on, as I said, the Fury came out with the 303. This was a Canadian design engine for the Plymouth. Now, it later was bumped up to the 318, but that 303 put out over 200 horsepower with the dual quads and was a good performing car. Hi, Bobby Dye. You take care, too. See you on the Salt. Going up to Bonneville. We'll be leaving on Friday. Not sure what day we'll arrive there. We're going to stop in Salt Lake and for a few days and meet and greet with my stepdaughter, and the grandkids. We're going to be up there. Chevrolet's automatic transmission, much like Ford's and GM's, were 2-speed automatic, and they had 3-speed manuals. 4-speed manuals weren't out yet, not for passenger cars anyway. But, well, that's just the way it was back in those days. I'm Hot Rod Bob. We talked Tri-5s, and we didn't talk Chevrolets too much. Mopars, the choice for me for a Tri-5. Although, guys, I've owned a whole bunch of Tri-5 Chevys. Got a Tri-5 Ford right now, too, and never really had a Tri-5 Plymouth in my stable. May have to work on that. You never know. All right, guys, you have a great day. Guys and gals, thanks for tuning in for GAAS, the Great American Auto Scene. Gustavo, thank you for sharing my YouTube channel. Again, you can go to GAAS on YouTube, Bob Beck, Hot Rod Bob, and become a subscriber to GAAS and see all the past GAAS shows. And you can also subscribe to Two Tired Guys Productions, where we have the formal 1-hour GAAS show and Talking About Cars show. And it is absolutely free to be on either one of those YouTube channels. So please join us there. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got GAAS, brought to you by Service Tech Equipment. When you need to work on your car in your garage, you need the proper tools. Service Tech Equipment. the people to contact. Mention Bob Beck or GAAS-Great American Auto Scene and get 10% off on the new Pulse Charger system that keeps that battery going strong. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got gas, the morning edition. Thanks for tuning in. Take care, folks. And we'll be talking to you on the road starting Friday and tell you all about what's going on, what's hot and what's not at Bonneville. Take care. You have a great day.